Welcome to this episode of Intellectual Conservatism. Today I'm here with Father Gregory Pine. I've had him on the show before to talk about Catholicism and the good life. And today we're here to talk about a new book that he's writing or going to be published titled, it's about prudence. That's all I know for the most part. Father Pine, how about you give me the rest of the details about the book?
Sure, gladly. So it's a book that was pitched, it's got to be like 2.5 years ago now, and that I wrote up until about a year ago now, and then since has been in whatever stages of editing and polishing for the past year, and it is ready in the sense that I think the Kindle version is now available, and then the print version will be available shortly. It's called Prudence, Choose Confidently, Live Boldly. So you start off with one of those virtues that people find incredibly boring, but then you spice it up with a kind of exhortation towards things that people are generally interested in, namely choosing confidently and living boldly. It's published by Our Sunday Visitor. It's like 165 pages long. And for a man who ordinarily speaks in a way that is inscrutable even to himself, I would say of this book that it is actually readable, which is fascinating because not everything that I do could be characterized as such. So it's the book I would say is pretty easy to read. And I hope that it's helpful to folks. So yeah, that's a basic sketch.
So Father Pine, tell me what inspired you to really explore the virtue of prudence?
It's a fascinating question. Sometimes when people ask questions about why Dominicans do things, you get answers on two levels. All right. So people be like, why is your habit white? And then why is your cap black? And the answer is because white is the color of undyed wool, and because black is something different. And it's easy to keep clean insofar as you don't notice when it's not clean. But then you'll hear people say it's because white signifies purity and black signifies penitence, both of which are true. Those are just answers in different registers. So I'm going to give you two answers in different registers. First answer is because the publisher contacted me and asked me to write a book about prudence.
Interesting.
The second answer is because this corresponds, I think, to a big need in our current day and age for cultivating the habits of mind and heart, which help us to choose well and to be happy. I think that there's a lot of confusion, maybe not confusion, but maybe a lot of anguish surrounding questions of discernment, or questions of conscience, questions of practical wisdom more broadly. And the operative virtue there is prudence. Prudence is what empowers us to be protagonists of our own life. It's what frees us to choose without kind of becoming overly involved in the consequences, or approaching life as if it were just a balance sheet from which we hope to gain the most, kind of pleasant goods and avoid the most unpleasant trials. Rather, it's a virtue which makes it so that we live well and become good. And I think that there's a huge need for that. There's a huge need for conversations pertaining to that. And so this book is just a way to, infuse some excellent principles, some decent arguments into that conversation.
And I'm interested in, the sources that you use, right? So for instance, I think Aristotle's probably going to appear somewhere in the book, St. Thomas Aquinas, right? Do you draw more upon the ancient wisdom on the virtue of prudence, or are there any contemporary sources that you use? And to what extent do you put yourself into the text?
Yeah, so I'm like I say, with some frequency, I'm just a hack Thomist. So I'm just I'm in the habit of repeating things that St. Thomas says. It's like blind squirrel kind of finds a nut type situation. I found one nut, and then I opened that nut and I found out that nut had written 85 books, which were really great. So this blind squirrel is very pleased with this discovery. I draw a lot from Aristotle and St. Thomas beyond any shadow of a doubt. And then on the subsequent tradition that work with that kind of understanding of prudence. So people who kind of comment on Aristotle and St. Thomas Aquinas. And then I'm drawing a lot from my own experience, and then just drawing a lot from conversations that I had with mostly young people. So I worked for the Thomistic Institute for 2 years. My job was to visit college campuses and be like a Thomistic pump man or pump up man or hype man, or however you want to describe it. I was trying to avoid the word cheerleader. So I succeeded, except I didn't. So I just like having a lot of conversations with people about their lives and how they can realize their goals. And I realized that there's just a real need for this. And so a lot of my thoughts were refined in the context of those conversations, and then in conversations with friends more broadly. So those would be the main sources.
Yeah, and in your conversations with young people, what did you notice they needed prudence or help in, right? So what kinds of areas and things were they thinking about?
Yeah, I think that there's a kind of, I don't know what you would call it, but there's a kind of terror that comes with the recognition that our lives are towards perfection, but not yet perfect. I think that a lot of people with whom I was meeting,
Mhm.
sweet Christmas, man, I got to relearn how to talk. A lot of the people with whom I was meeting, motivated people, interested people, oftentimes, like smart, intelligent people. And so they have a kind of understanding that if I'm going to, do this thing right, I need to do this thing perfectly. And then they come up against the concrete and particular material circumstances of their limited lives. And there's almost immediately this recognition that, woof, it's really hard to determine what perfection looks like in the here and now,
Mhm.
especially if you just take freeze frame pictures of each of the individual or discrete choices that you're called upon to make. So that can be really discouraging. It can be really bewildering, because it can be anxiety inducing to think about every decision like it has to be perfect, as if cultivated in a petri dish and then only sent forth when it had grown to full stature. But that's just not the case, because right. So St. Thomas describes God as what would you say, a being that is its end, and he describes angels as a being that attain to their end by one movement, and then he describes human beings as beings that attain to their end by many movements. All right. So we as human beings live a life in the shape of a kind of pilgrimage, right? In this kind of narrative arc. And so for us, the real drama is to grow in virtue, because virtue is the principle whereby we navigate this life beautifully and well. But we can't expect to have been, like fully virtuous yesterday, or to have already come to our full stature as virtuous human beings, because then what's the sense of having a whole life? Right? The whole life is for the growth. And so we are perfect insofar as we are tending unto perfection, insofar as we believe and we hope and we love unto a greater perfection. And so our choices should be characterized by that understanding, which is to say, we seek to do what is virtuous, and then things come as a result. We incorporate them into future decisions, but we're not paralyzed by the fear that things might go wrong, because often enough they will go wrong. But we're not defeated by the fact of negative consequences. We're only defeated by ultimate tragedy, right? Which is to say, damnation. So God can use everything in our lives, including sin, including vice, including misadventure, to pull forth from it a kind of beautiful and virtuous narrative arc. And so I think that that's really what came forth from those discussions, and what I hope to communicate going forward. Yeah.
All right, so let's get into prudence itself now. So,
Let's do it.
everybody knows that prudence might mean something like, wise decision making. Maybe prudence and wisdom are quite similar. Who knows? You can probably individuate them further. But when people hear prudence, and they think about these broad, abstract, like good things, they're like, okay, yeah, but what does that mean? Right? Like, is there any practical meat to what we're talking about here, or what do we need to know to really be prudent?
Yeah, that is a good question. So St. Thomas describes prudence as right reason and things to be done. So it's like practical wisdom. Prudence concerns matters that are for doing. That's a tortured sentence. Prudence concerns like making, as it were, but like the making of agency. So
Mhm.
prudence is about living well. It's about living virtuously. So you can think about it as the virtue which informs making decisions, but I think it's more appropriate probably to talk about it as the virtue which informs our life as an agent or as a protagonist. So it's the virtue that kind of puts you in the driver's seat, because when you're not virtuous in this way, when you're vicious, right, you're not really in the driver's seat of your life. And I'm mixing metaphors a little bit insofar as God is the one who is ultimately responsible insofar as he gives us to be and gives us to act. But he gives us to be and gives us to act as a real agent, as a secondary cause, right? And as a result of which, we should own that agency. We should adopt or assume that agency with a sense of it being wholly and fully ours, albeit from God, but wholly and fully ours. So when you talk about prudence, I think to get like a more concrete sense of it, it's helpful to talk about its parts. So St. Thomas describes it as having integral parts, which are like the parts when taken together make up prudence. And he lists them as docility, memory, shrewdness, foresight, reasoning, understanding, caution, and circumspection. And just a brief thumbnail sketch of maybe a couple of those. So docility, for instance, is the capacity to receive from others who have seen it already, so the older, the wiser, those who have suffered, those who have endured. Memory means that we actually retain what it is that we ourselves have experienced or suffered or endured, all right? And we retain it not just as like a list of trivial facts, but we retain it as a kind of savoir-faire. We retain it as a memory like in our body. We retain it as a memory in our agency. So it's not like, all right, I've made this bad decision in the past and I'm destined to repeat it unto ages of ages. It's like, okay, what is this teaching me? And how do I incorporate this in my life? Shrewdness, right? So shrewdness is the capacity to make good snap judgments. All right. So you see a car accident at this intersection and everyone's frozen, just totally aghast. And you recognize the fact that this could mean a back injury and that this engine is smoking. And so you need to backboard this person out of the driver's seat without upsetting them too terribly much. It's like, all right, you made that judgment. Maybe that's because of your training as an EMT. Maybe that's just because you've seen like a lot of NCIS. Is that the name of a show? Yeah. So whatever, okay? But it's this capacity to make snap judgments so that you get in the game, which for us is revelatory, because prudence isn't about just wringing your hands and deliberating or taking counsel until Jesus returns. Prudence is about action. And if it's about action, then we need to be well disposed to action. And shrewdness was, sometimes the answer given time, place, setting, and circumstance. So that's just a few parts, but I think they help us to gain an appreciation for the fact that, prudence, yes, it takes counsel, it makes judgments, it commands a particular activity, but ultimately it's about agency.
And so what's the connection to a prudence to, let's say, happiness, right? So to experiencing, if I'm saying the Greek right, eudaimonia, right? This kind of fulfillment.
Yeah. So I think, that is the question of the first chapter of the book. And the basic idea is that happiness is a sense of fit. Okay. Yeah, happiness is to do the things for which you were made. And happiness is effectively to do them well. And for us as prudent human beings, please God, we get a knack for our humanity, right? Because we as human beings are distinguished from those other creatures below us, like beasts, by the fact that we have an intellect and we have a will. So we're capable of knowing the truth and of choosing in light of what we know. So we are choosing beasts. All right. That's what sets us apart from like elk or from, what have I seen recently? Chamois, which is the fancy French word for ibex or ibises, which I see with some frequency in the Swiss Alps. All right. So we have minds with which to know and we have hearts with which to love. And prudence is one of those virtues which informs those faculties, those powers of the soul, so that they are fixed on their objects with a greater stability or greater permanence, a greater fixity, so that we can enjoy those goods, so that we can abide in those goods. And our enjoyment and abiding in the good as the fruit of an activity is just what we mean by happiness. All right. So happiness isn't for us to have like 1,000 donuts, or isn't for us to like be perpetually sprawled out on a chaise lounge at the side of whatever pool in some resort town in some island far, far away from here. No, happiness is for us to fire on all cylinders. It's to be engaged in the living of our lives with the conviction that it is for this reason that we have come. And prudence is one of the virtues, one of the foremost virtues, which emboldens and empowers just such like activity. So yes, prudence is intimately associated with the attaining to happiness. And I would dare say without prudence, it is not possible to be happy.
So could you give us some concrete cases where we can look and see, like, how would prudence teach us how to discern, this circumstance or any others that, we would commonly find in our lives?
Yes, I will think of an example. All right. So I'm writing my dissertation right now. All right. I don't read books like self-help books or life hack books. I suspect that I could probably benefit from them in some way, shape, or form, but I choose to read other things instead. But I've heard that one of these kind of self-help life hack books for organizing your work life commends the practice of working for 50 hours a week. That's a kind of sweet spot in terms of productivity. Now, there are some types of work where you can work way more than that and not really lose much in the way of like effectiveness. My experience, though, is that with intellectual work, like if your work is to think about the mysteries of God's interior life and then how those mysteries are transposed into a human register, that fatigue poses a serious obstacle. So I was coming back from a conference in Rome this past weekend, And I had one train delay, and then I had a second train delay, and then I was like, blah blah blah, thus and such. Story isn't interesting, but I ended up getting home at like 1,030,000,030, and the next day I was not effective, just not effective at all at working on my dissertation, which was frustrating. But then I slept, and then the past 2 days have been good. Okay, so given what I know, based on the experience of, what my sweet spot is for working on my dissertation, how I should arrange my life, how I should arrange my weekends, how I should arrange my travel in light of that, this actually translates to very concrete decisions. So next time I go to Italy, for instance, I'm not going to book the same trains, because as good as the train system in Switzerland is, the train system in Italy is just as bad. All right. So I had a 24-hour, correspondence. That's not enough. All right. I need like a day and a half to make sure that I don't miss my next train. With respect to the Italians, whom I love, their coffee is lights out, and their cuisine is unimaginably good. But trains, not their jam. All right. So I will arrange my travel differently. So do I have to be in Italy anytime soon? No, but if I go to Rome, I might fly, right? Door to door, it's probably about an hour and a half faster. It's, ecologically more impactful. And it might be probably a comparable price, but I hate airports right now because of COVID tide being just like a source of endless trauma. So I usually opt to take a train, but these huge delays were equally traumatic. So I'm weighing all of these factors. All right. So I'm registering my experience. I'm having conversations with other friars in my convent about what they've done in terms of travel arrangements with respect to Italy. I'm looking at prices, in the concrete here and now. I'm making a decision based on what's actually economically feasible, what I can get the people who are sponsoring the conference to pay for, what I myself will have to shoulder, things like that. Right. But I have my nostrils to the wind. So I'm testing my theses against the reality with which I am confronted. And I'm trying to formulate a practical wisdom which is actionable and which will contribute to a greater partaking of the goods which God has put at my disposal. So what do I want to do? I want to glorify God and save souls. What is one of the principal ways in which I'm called to do that right now? Writing my dissertation. I have to supplement that dissertation with academic engagement of this sort, but I have to arrange my travel in such a way that it genuinely contributes and doesn't detract from, and as a result of which I need to be prudent. So that is an example that for me is very close to home. I do not know to what extent it translates to other people's experience, but I hope that it does.
Well, actually, to maybe something that everyone can connect to from that story is when you need to say no, right? When you have to say, I can't really do this, or I can't do it this way anymore. Or, like when people overwork themselves, right? And then they have to take a day to really take care of themselves, their mental health, so on and so forth. So I'm interested then in this idea of when you also have to say no in order to be prudent, right? So could you talk a little bit about just that aspect, right? Like balancing things in moderation, that's, that kind of element.
Yeah. No, I think you begin, with a good insight. And what that occasions in my thought is, the human person is not a robot. Okay. The human person is a very, very delicately balanced, embodied soul, right? So what we're talking about has an organic component in which subsists a spiritual component, which together constitute as a composite the one human thing. But like while our intellect, isn't tied to a corporeal organ, it impeded, right, by the poor functioning of certain corporeal organs. Father Gregory, did you just describe this in the most boring way possible? Yes, I did. Will you make it more interesting? Yes, I will. Okay. So like, for instance, in my life, I'm typically working on my dissertation Monday through Friday, and my workday usually goes from 7:40 a.m. until 6:45 p.m. with a pause in the middle for midday prayer, and then lunch, and then recreation. And then in the evenings, I'm typically doing like whatever, thus and such, spiritual direction, recording a podcast, yada, yada. Who cares? I mean, people care. Those things are important. But I try to keep, for instance, Saturdays free. So I can go hiking. So I can just kind of like get away from my work, create a little mental space, and also just like experience the type of, I don't know what you would call it, like contemplative distance, which permits me to mull on the things that I'm thinking about in a less what would you say, a less deliberate or a less intentional way to kind of just let a little bit of a free association run wild. Now, do I always spend Saturday hiking? No, I think I've actually gone hiking twice in the past 2.5 months because I keep saying yes to other things, which are good, right? Which are awesome. So like this conference that I just mentioned, or like one of the brothers made solemn profession the weekend before, or like what happened the weekend before. I went to Antwerp for another one of the brothers' profession. So cool things are happening all over the place. Or apostolic engagement is often a thing that takes that time, which is great, which I celebrate. But at a certain point, sometimes I realize that I just I'm just not working anymore. I'm just like not functioning as a human being. I'm beginning to treat myself and my life, as it were, kind of robotically, which then begins to I am complicit in the process of dehumanizing myself. And when you dehumanize yourself, you lose something of the human culture in which you're meant to live, in which you're meant to flourish. And so you no longer experience the kind of contemplative delights which would ordinarily accompany, your living and moving and breathing. So I don't have time for literature. And as a result of which, I'm not thinking about, what am I thinking about right now? Turgenev's Father and Sons and the kind of rebellious upcoming generation, which a revolutionary generation, which eats its parents rather than reverences them. Right? These are things that I want to think about, not because they're directly pertinent to my dissertation, because they're directly pertinent to my humanity. And my humanity is the point at which, or is the place in which I interface with God. Interface is such a stupid word. That's where I meet Jesus. All right. Because our Lord Jesus Christ took human flesh to meet me there. But if I lose touch with my humanity on account of the fact that I am not free enough to say no, then as a result, I lose a kind of handhold in the Godhead. And I lose a little bit of my bearings when it comes to his glory and my salvation. So I think while sometimes it may seem selfish or self-indulgent to say no, I think you have to, because I think you are only free as your no. And that doesn't mean, again, that we begin to guard our times with a kind of jealousy, which does not admit of sacrifice or of generosity, but it does mean that we have a sense of who we are and where our humanity is healed and elevated. And so, those are some thoughts.
When you talk about like withdrawing, to just kind of be with yourself and even like hiking and whatnot, it actually very much, it reminded me of Christ. And so I was interested if you could comment a little bit about how Christ teaches us prudence, or how he displays prudence in his own life.
Yeah. I mean, certainly the Lord commends it. Be ye therefore as innocent as doves and as crafty as serpents, he says. And the word there for crafty is phronimoi, like be, that's just the word that Aristotle uses for the prudent person. Okay. So the phronimos is the prudent man, the one who is practically wise. So the Lord commends it. And everything that he commends, obviously, he embodies, because all virtues come to us through Christ. Christ is the exemplar cause of all the virtues which we partake of. And so where do we see Christ being prudent? I mean, certainly you see it in certain of his engagements with the Pharisees, the way in which he is able to evade their traps, both physically, right? He passed through their midst, or he was hidden from them. And then in speech, when it'll talk about these, different things that they pose to him about the resurrection of the body and the Sadducees, or, the Son of David being called the Lord and things like that. Okay. So, we see his kind of acuity of mind in practical matters, both in jest, in behavior, pardon me, and in word. And so I think that, just taking this example of taking time to pray, which you mentioned, it's especially in the Gospel of Luke where the Lord kind of draws apart. And it's in the Gospel of Luke also that we have that story which commends the priority of the contemplative life. So I think it's like Luke 8 or Luke 9, the story of Mary and Martha, and Mary has chosen the better part and it will not be taken from her. She's chosen the one thing necessary. And so I think that for us, our prudence is based on a kind of simple recognition that our lives are bound up with God, right? Our lives make sense, or our lives matter to the extent that they are the Lord's. And there's no greater prudence than to be the Lord's. Because by contrast, what St. Thomas calls a prudence of the flesh is imprudent, right? To set our minds and hearts on mundane things, on worldly things, actually makes it such that we become less than we are destined to be. Like we kind of give up something of our inheritance. We sell our birthright and go in instead for whatever, the feed of swine. So the Lord's drawing apart, right? The Lord's willingness to say a harsh word in correction, all right? He jests or chides the sons of thunder, and he tells Peter to get behind him as if he were Satan. These are very striking passages in which the Lord seems, as it were, to be mean. But the Lord is directing their attention to that one thing necessary, and he is helping them to sort through the arguments which would conduct them hence. So for him, it's not a matter of being nice or being kind in the kind of pious pablum way that you often hear that peddled. But rather for him, it's about directing the gaze of those who are in his tutelage, for whom he is the master and teacher, to the things of greatest importance so that their lives can be organized or ordered around them. So yeah, there is manifest evidence of the Lord's prudence in the scriptures, and certainly the promise that he will communicate what he models or what he exemplifies.
All right, Father Pine, I think I have like 4 more questions, so let's try to hit him out. So
let's do it. No rush. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, so one of the questions, so actually, going back to Jesus and going to God, I know this is kind of a classical theist question, so maybe I don't know if it's as appropriate for this upcoming book, but I mean, could we say that there's something like prudence in God?
Yeah, we can. So sources for that would be Summa Theologiae Prima Secundae, question 61, article 5, in which St. Thomas talks about the exemplar virtues, and it's on the pattern of Macrobius's Dream of Scipio. And then Summa Contra Gentiles, book 1, chapters 92 through 94. So there are certain things, virtues, that need to be purified in order to kind of root them in the Godhead, which is to say that there's nothing of human limitation which we can subsequently like retroject into God. But we can identify the perfections which pre-contain virtually, as it were, the perfections of those virtues as they're embodied by human persons. So in God, St. Thomas will say, and this is in Prima Secundae, question 61, article 5, prudence is just providence, right? So prudence comes from the Latin porro videns, which means far seeing, and providence is to see forward, as it were. So they're effectively the same thing. So our prudence is a participation in God's providence, which is awesome.
I just like how straightforward that was, Father Pine. Yeah, I mean, maybe if I could just tease that question out a little bit more. I mean, like, we're dealing with a God who's omnipotent, right? So he could do anything that's logically possible, and make things go the way that he wants them to go, right? But I mean, for instance, take like the church, right? So God wanted the church to be unified. And so I think Rob Koons makes his argument in his book, A Lutheran's Case for Roman Catholicism. But, if God's going to will the end, then he also has to effectively will the means, right? So for instance, if God wants the church to be one, well, humans need institutions to unify around, visible authority structures or something like that, right? So what Rob says is that God will govern things according to their natures, or what's appropriate to their natures. Would you agree with that kind of argumentation?
Yes, as long as we're talking about it in terms of fittingness, not necessity, which is, I suspect, what he's doing. Yeah, no, for sure.
All right. So, okay, here are my last 3 questions. So as a college student, or just students in general who are listening to this, or even, parents and everyday people who are going to work, we have this problem known as procrastination. And sometimes, sometimes like when we're really motivated, we get the thing done right away. When we aren't motivated, we actually need the impending stress of the deadline to make us work, right? And so this isn't always conducive to happiness or what have you. But how do we overcome this? I don't know if you can call it a vice. Perhaps it is, right? This vice of procrastination, or maybe laziness.
Yeah. So I'm not too terribly worried about procrastination. I just actually thought for the first time that I've never thought about the Latin root of procrastination, pro, which is, and then cross is to procrastinate. That's awesome. So I'm not too terribly worried about procrastination if it doesn't cause negative effects in the individual. So whether you do a thing way before the deadline, or whether you do a thing right before the deadline, or whether you do a thing piecemeal and anticipate the deadline, I don't think it matters necessarily. There are certain things that can't be procrastinated because they're integral to a flourishing human life. So you can't procrastinate prayer, for instance. You can't say, all right, I'll get to praying just as soon as I'm about to die. 1, you don't know the day or the hour. And 2, prayer isn't just a something you fill up at the end. It's not just like a rental car where so long as you return it with a full tank, you're good to go. It's about like a kind of continual maintenance in the Godhead, right? It's about healing and elevating so that your life has a kind of no like narrative coherence to it. But whether you balance your checkbook on the 7th or on the 21st, I just don't think it matters. Just so long as you do it and you do it somewhat regularly and you do it in a way that's virtuous. But the thing that you mentioned immediately after that, namely like laziness, that's where you start kind of getting into more problematic things. If you're temperamentally or dispositionally ill-suited to undertaking any task now or even later, right, that may not be good. Now, some of that might just be nature, nurture. That just might be formation, which needs to be overcome, but may not be ever wholly and entirely overcome. But what do you do then? I mean, you cultivate virtues which ameliorate it or soften its effect on your life. So I think like you hear some people say, for instance, I'm not a morning person, which I can grant. Some people aren't good in the morning. So you shape your life so that, it better accounts for that fact. Like I met this wife who is in the pastoral formation program here in Freiburg. She has 3 little kids and black backstory, blah, blah, blah. Basically, she has to be in Freiburg real early on the morning on Monday. And if she's going to get there in time, leaving from where they live in Geneva, she would have to leave at on the 4:30 a.m. train, which is punishing. So just knowing yourself, knowing that she's not especially good in the morning, right? She comes up to Freiburg early, and then she's at morning mass at 6:50 a.m. All right. So she knows she's not a morning person, but you see her at mass at 6:50 a.m. Why? Well, because Christians pray in the morning. Do you have to go to daily mass? No. But do you have to pray in the morning? I think the answer to that is yes. Okay. Does that mean that you can't pray in the evening? No, but I think you need to pray a little bit in the morning if you're Christian, because just based on my reading of sacred scripture, it seems like everyone's doing it. So I'm not worried too much about procrastination. When it gets into kind of temperamental indisposition in the way of laziness, a little more problematic, but you can soften that. When it gets into like aphasia or sloth, which is a kind of sadness at the exaltation of the divine good because you deem it unattainable, that's like a serious problem. That's a vice opposed to charity. And that merits its own episode wholly and entirely. So I'll just leave that off.
And actually, that was going to be part of my next question. So, for instance,
Nice.
Sometimes when you are trying to be prudent, right, and you're looking at the world and you realize like, okay, for instance, let's say I can't achieve the utopia, right? And we're never going to achieve the utopia this side of, before Christ's second coming. So, some people, especially in conservative thought or conservative philosophy, not just like typical right wing stuff, but like actual conservative intellectual thought. It's like there's this doctrine known as the tragic vision, where there are intrinsic limits to human beings. We can only do so much. Sometimes we have good intentions, they don't play out well, what have you, right? Institutions and governments are limited. Now, some people will say, well, this is just like kind of defeatist thinking, or some people will say, how do you avoid just this deep-rooted pessimism, right? And so you talked about this already, but when we're trying to be prudent and we recognize that we live in an imperfect world and that the world is imperfect, we can make steps to make things better, right? But how do we not fall into this state of despair?
Yeah, I think that part of it is framing the question, and I think it's an important part of it. There's got to be a freedom that comes with the recognition that you are not expected to do this all optimally or maximally. The point of human life is not to optimize or to maximize. The point of human life is to love, right? In the evening of our lives, says St. John on the cross, we will be judged on love alone. So with that comes a recognition that I'm going to go about it in suboptimal or submaximal ways, probably a great deal of the time. But that's okay, because by God's grace, I can continue to grow. And that's what makes life exciting and dramatic. I've once heard the spiritual life described as slipping on a banana peel and then falling uphill for the entirety of your life. So how God conducts it, safely and happily to its end is a mystery known only to him, but we can actually participate that mystery. We can suffer that mystery in some way, shape, or form such that it makes more and more sense. Because by the exercise of prudence, our minds are gradually assimilated to his providence, which is to say that we gain a deeper and deeper appreciation for our agency, the role that agency plays in the glory of God and the salvation of souls, so that we're able to undertake that agency more willingly, more wholeheartedly, more excellently, which is a glorious prospect. But it's just decidedly the case that our lives are kind of like dumpster fires, and they're going to continue to be kind of like dumpster fires until such time as they're not, right? Which is going to take a while. That's okay. That's okay. Because the point is to approach it with love, to conduct it with love, to see it through with love. And we seek to cultivate these virtues so that we can, incorporate a kind of practical wisdom given by God more and more into each and every one of our various ventures. But yeah, it's not going to be perfect yesterday. It's not going to be perfect today. It's probably not going to be perfect tomorrow. But we have the faith, we have the hope that it can tend in that direction. So yeah, those are some thoughts.
Yeah, and one additional question before I get to my last one. What steps can we take, Father, to grow in prudence? Should I be reading a certain thing? Well, obviously scripture, right? But also, should I be talking to certain people? What can I do?
Yeah. So I think good things for prudence are committed relationships, family and friends, because people keep you honest and people kind of reflect back to you what is good and what is bad. And they help you to sort through your life in a way that's sympathetic. So when sometimes somebody comes from outside and says, you're wrong, it's very hard to incorporate that criticism. But when somebody who loves you puts it before you or sets it before you, it's a lot easier to weigh it, to judge it, to incorporate it accordingly. So kind of being attentive to your committed relationships insofar as they demand of you greater and greater virtue. And they flourish to the extent that you are virtuous, and they do not to the extent that you are not. The next thing I would say is, kind of have a habit of recollection, both in prayer and in study. And journaling can contribute to that. But like have a sense for your life in its totality and kind of cultivate a sense of the offering of your life in its totality to God for his sifting, right? For his refining. And I think that, journaling can be good at certain times in life. At other times in life, it's not as good. So you don't have to be too terribly dependent upon it. Another thing is reading good literature, because when we read good literature, we're able to experience, as it were, the lives of those who are portrayed in the literature, so that we can be like, oh, don't make that decision. It's a bad decision, because the point is to like avert catastrophe. The point of literature is to communicate something of the truth. It's to spin out a human reality so that you can inhabit it. But you're able to experience life in a kind of accelerated fashion or in a kind of concentrated fashion through literature. And as a result of which, to experience more of reality, as it were, vicariously. That author has a kind of insight into a human reality, transposes that insight into prose or into verse, so that you can assimilate it and that you can be conformed to it or imitated, or as it were, kind of patterned on it. And so, I would say committed relationships, friends and family, a practice of recollection, both in prayer and in study, journaling being an example, and then good literature as vicarious prudential formation.
Do you have any recommendations?
For good literature?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I don't typically recommend literature too terribly much, because it is honestly like a preference thing. I recommended Chesterton to somebody at one point, and the person was like, I hate you. I will always hate you. I was like, wow, fascinating. So what are things that I've read recently that I've liked a lot? Contemporary authors. I've read a lot of Kazuo Ishiguro recently, who, there you go. I don't need to explain. So great. Kazuo Ishiguro is something that I've read recently. What else have I read recently? I've read some Jorge Luis Borges. Like I read his Collected Ficciones, which was bizarre. I listened to a book that I just finished, and it was, I just read Anna Karenina. I love Leo Tolstoy. I just love Leo Tolstoy. So I've only read the two books, Anna Karenina and War and Peace. So there you go. There's something first Japanese, British, then something Argentinian, and then something Russian. So those are my recommendations.
Nice. All right. So Father Pine, here's my last question. So as I looked at your book, or at least at the manuscript, I noticed that, one chapter is, am I prudent? Right. But there are other parts that you also cover, like, obviously we already covered, am I happy? Right. But am I bold? Am I certain? Am I confident? These sorts of questions. Right. And so I'm interested in, you talking more about your book and talking about, so am I prudent? We would expect maybe that to be the question of the book, but it's located among other questions, right? So where do the other questions fill in the conversation on prudence?
Yeah, basically, so 8 chapters. The first chapter is about happiness to motivate the question, because if you're not asking the question, you're not going to find the answer interesting. And then the next chapter is about the means that God gives whereby we attain to that happiness. So it's about God, his Christ, creation and redemption, grace, virtues, gifts of the Holy Spirit. And then the next chapter is about the virtuous life, basically as those principles which are closest to us, those principles through which we act well, and become good. And then chapters 4 and 5 are just basically about prudence and how prudence interacts with the other virtues to bring your life together. And then the final 3 chapters, 6, 7, and 8, are about kind of teasing out the implications of what it would look like to live a prudent life. So Am I Bold is about, acting, right? It's prudence is a virtue poised for action. And then Am I Certain and Am I Confident are the most practical, because they're about managing our expectations for the type of certainty that we can expect from prudential discourse, so that we can be about the business of prudential discourse rather than always agonizing until such time as we arrive at sufficient certainty, or so that our efforts at virtuous agency aren't hamstrung by distractions or dispersions. So that's the basic shape. It's a lead into prudence, and then an unpacking of prudence, and then spinning out the consequences of prudence. That is how I would describe it.
All right, Father Pine, thank you so much for coming on to the show. It's funny because this time I noticed that I almost kept on saying Father Fine instead of Father Pine.
Well, that's on me, my friend.
Yeah.
I introduced it.
Yeah. Well, Father Pine, where can we find more of your work, and how can we keep up with all the things you're doing?
Yeah. What am I doing? So I'm contributing to 2 podcasts, Pints with Aquinas and Godsplaining. A cool thing about Godsplaining is that we're having retreats this summer. So 2 in July, 1 in August, to which y'all are most cordially invited. There's a all-comers retreat, young adults retreat, and then a young men's wilderness retreat. Information about those are on godsplaining.org. And then there's this book, which is available for purchase on amazon.com. And then what are other things? Are there other things? Are there other things that I should mention? I don't think so. I think those are the highlights. So we'll leave it at that.
All right. Well, that's all I got to say. So thank you, Father Pine.
Thanks so much.